Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis, the Prayers of Folly podcast. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe and hit the notification bell. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter, Telegram, and Facebook. I can be supported at Subscribe, Buy Me a Coffee, and Locals, and also be sure to check out my Substack. All right, we are back to FDR, Wall Street and FDR. Political influence and contract awards. FDR's political contacts and influences were, of course, well known within Fidelity and Deposit, and he was repeatedly called upon by other members of the firm to use his political experience and personal credit to generate bond business, even outside New York. This may be exemplified by a letter dated August 23, 1928, from F&D Director F.A. Price, in charge of the Chicago office. About business from local Chicago politicians, Price wrote, "Dear Franklin," with a message that since the death of Chicago political leader George Brennan, several names have been proposed as leaders of the local Democratic Party machine. Brennan, before his death, requested that M.L. Igoe be his successor. Price writes FDR. You undoubtedly got in touch with him while at Houston, and in the event you have a personal acquaintance with him, I would like to have you give me as strong a letter of recommendation to him as possible. Price noted that recently, when in Baltimore, he had discussions with F&D Company President Charles Miller about the thought of making some deal with the new Democratic leader in Illinois. It is with this view in mind that I wish the letter of introduction, as machine politics in Chicago has been notorious for its low ethical standards. It requires little imagination to visualize the kind of deal Price was suggesting, in which FDR used his name and influence to further. That personal friendship alone was insufficient to get bonding business, and that some variety of sweetener was used is brought out in a letter on the New York political situation dated September the 23rd, 1925, from John Griffin, in charge of the New York office contract division. My dear Mr. Roosevelt, it discusses the complex interconnections between New York political offices and the bond brokerage business. In part, the letter reads, the big victory of Walker over Highland will, of course, make a new setup in the bond broker situation. Sinnott and Canty, from whom we were able to get some bonds in the early part of the Highland administration, and in the latter part were not so much favored, will no doubt be out of it, and either Charles F. Murphy, Junior Hyman and McCall, Jim Hoey, or a man named McLaughlin, a brother of the banking superintendent, will be the favored one. As I see it, our strongest connection will be through Al Smith into Charlie Murphy or McCall or McLaughlin, as Hoey has his own company, the Columbia Casualty Company. Perhaps Murphy receives from the National Surety Company or the company to whom he gives business now a larger commission than we might be willing to give for his direct business. But a word into his ear through you and, of course, through the governor and possibly Jimmy Walker would at least put us under the most favorable nation clause or for any division of these bonds. As you know, all of them must be divided between two or more companies. I know all of these people pretty well and favorably, but my personal friendship will not be sufficient. A meticulous reading of the internal company letter suggests that kickbacks were the usual way to get bond business from New York government agencies. Note the paragraph, Murphy receives from the National Surety Company, or the company to whom he gives business, now a larger commission than we might be willing to give for his direct business. This concluding sentence, mere personal friendship will not be sufficient, has an ominous ring. Politicization of the surety business, so obvious in Chicago and New York, extended also to the federal government contract arena in Washington, D.C., on May the 5th, 1926, F&D Second Vice President F.A. Bach in Baltimore wrote FDR about $11.25 million Veterans Bureau building project for construction that spring. Dear Franklin, among other projects of the Veterans Bureau this spring is one involving approximately $1.25 million of Bedford, Massachusetts. And I'm secretly hoping that through influence such as knowing Mr. Rogers, representative of Massachusetts, that we might have some chance of getting a piece of that business, although, of course, the biggest project will be at Northport, Long Island. Similarly, to a contract in a firm holding Navy contracts, FDR wrote, A casual reference in a letter from one of my old friends in the Navy Department to the award of some 8-inch gun forgings to your company brought to my mind the very pleasant relations we held during my term as Assistant Secretary of the Navy, and I wondered if you would feel like letting my company write some of the contract bonds that you are obliged to give the government from time to time. I would very much like to have all our representatives call. Lewis Howe, FDR's right-hand man, also worked at F&D offices, also actively solicited bonds, and was not at all backward about canvassing business. Howe's letter to Homer Ferguson of the Newport News Shipping Company in December 1921 noted that the company had entered bids on construction of the vessel Leviathan and thanked Ferguson for the bond. If by chance the fact that this was Mr. Roosevelt's company influenced you in making this award, it would cheer Mr. Roosevelt tremendously if you could write him a little line to that effect. These political methods of doing business are, of course, a long way from the competitive marketplace of the college textbooks. It would be naive to think that the political preference and personal friendships have no role or only a minor role in business relationships. In reviewing FDR's bond business, however, it is difficult to visualize another business in which politics plays such an all-encompassing role as it did in the bonding and surety business in the 1920s. The morality of kickbacks and of the use of the political office to generate personal business is questionable, and the legality is definitely doubtful. Much less obvious is the consequent loss of economic efficiency and loss to the society as a whole. If purchase and sale of such bonds is determined by price, and past performance and personal acquaintance can be a legitimate factor in judging past performance, then the market will yield maximum economic benefits and efficiency for society. In a politicized business atmosphere, these impartial competitive factors are eliminated. Economic efficiency is foregone and benefits are reduced. We have, in effect, a microcosm of a socialist economy in which all decisions are politicized to the detriment of society as a whole. In brief, FDR's bonding operations were to some degree antisocial. Yet other letters in the Roosevelt files provide authentic glimpses into the back rooms of 1920-era politics, the wheeling and dealing that has so often degenerated into outright corruption. Witness an FDR letter dated July the 11th, 1928, to Vice President George L. Radcliffe in Baltimore, relating to the manner in which John J. Raskob became chairman of the Democratic National Committee. Raskob was vice president of DuPont and of General Motors, and consequently as much a member of the Wall Street establishment as could be found anywhere. At a meeting last night, the Governor Smith definitely decided on John J. Raskob as chairman of the National Committee. He said he wanted an organizer and a man who would bring the Democratic Party into favor with the business interests of the country. My first judgment is that it is a grave mistake, as he is a Catholic. Secondly, he is even wetter than Smith, seeking the repeal of the 18th Amendment. And third, he is the head of the largest business organization in the world. I fear it will permanently drive away a host of people in the South and West and rural East who are not particularly favorable to Smith, but who up to today have been seeping back into the party. I don't know Raskob very well, but I expect to have a conference with him within a few days, and will mention, among other things, the possibility of VLB, Van Leer Black. Later in this book, we shall record the enormous funds poured into the Democratic Party by Raskob and the quid pro quo for big business, the New Deal and the National Recovery Administration, NRA. On August 24th, 1927, another letter to George Radcliffe outlined the manner in which the bonding industry could get together on behalf of James Beha, then superintendent of insurance in the state of New York. This quotation confirms the fact that regulated industries are no more than political devices to keep unwelcome competition at bay, and that the regulators can be in the pockets and act on behalf of the supposedly regulated industry. Vic Cullen and I have just had a talk in regard to Superintendent Beha. Vic says that he thinks there is some move on foot initiated by Joyce to get Beha into the National in some capacity, and Cullen makes what to me seems the most worthwhile suggestion, and is that Beha might become the head of the Surety Association. We all like Beha and trust him. He is a man of courage and independence, and I cannot think of anyone better suited for the position. Of course, it would cost a high salary. My thought is $35,000 a year, but this divided up among all the members amount to but a drop in the bucket. If you think well of this suggestion, Colin, and I both feel that you are the man rather than either of us to approach the heads of American, U.S., F&G, and one of the two others in any informal and confidential way. Let's see. On the other hand, there were attempts in New York to eliminate abuses in the bonding business. One such effort was that by state architect Sullivan W. Jones to eliminate a state requirement for bonds. Governor Al Smith was at first introduced to extend his approval to the Jones Plan. This brought a swift letter to FDR from R.H. Towner at 160 Broadway to the effect that the Jones Plan would be disastrous, and if Governor Smith has gone astray, some of his friends ought to put him right. FDR's prompt reply to Towner was, "I hope to see the governor in the next couple of weeks, and will then talk to him like a Dutch uncle about Jones's plan. We need no more in the FDR files about abolishing compulsory surety bonds in the state of New York." That F&D's office was hard-nosed about its own interests is reflected even in relatively minor matters. For example, no New York Business Association was able to win F&D financial support. On August the 5th, 1926, a request from the Better Business Bureau of New York for a subscription evoked a cold response from F&D. FDR passed a letter to Vice President Cullen to prepare a suitable reply, and Cullen promptly turned down the Better Business Bureau. This turndown was supported by President Charles R. Miller in Baltimore. "I am not so keen on making a contribution towards the Better Business Bureau at this time." Then the Merchants Association of New York wrote FDR on May the 23rd, 1925, about membership of F&D in their association. Again, Cullen argued that the Merchants Association is of absolutely no benefit to us. No law requires membership in Better Business Associations, but these brush-offs make suspect do-gooder social appeals from these non-joiners. The payoff for Fidelity and Deposit Company. This brief review of Franklin Delano D. Roosevelt's career from 1921 to 1928 as vice president of Fidelity and Deposit Company in New York suggests the philosophical road Roosevelt followed for the next 2 decades. The bonding business was pervasively political, and FDR in politics was like a duck in water. Political contacts made during his service as Assistant Secretary of the Navy were utilized to the full. New political contacts, encouraged by the Baltimore management of F&D, were made, and FDR had 7 years to practice this art of politics and business. The results for F&D were exceptionally good. Business expanded in some measures, perhaps because almost all business expanded in the 1920s, but almost certainly to a major extent because of FDR's political activities. In the period January 1st, 1923 to January 1st, 1924, Fidelity and Deposit showed a gain of $3 million in the year and surged into third place among the bonding companies, a good jump ahead of U.S. Fidelity and Casualty Co., a displaced competitor. The figures read, okay, we'll just look at this. Surety Company bonds in the state of New York. The Fidelity and Deposit Office at 120 Broadway was FDR's base of operations in the 1920s. But the bonding business, successful as it was not FDR's only business activity. Other interesting endeavors will be explored in subsequent chapters. These 7 years in politically charged business atmosphere, a microcosm of a socialist society, because socialist societies are also politically run economies, were undoubtedly a determining influence in FDR's later approaches to solutions of national economic problems. This was FDR's first exposure to the business world. It was not an exposure to the competitive market elements of price and product quality. It was exposure to business on the basis of whom do you know and what are your politics. Ultimately, the most inefficient and unprofitable basis possible for business enterprise. Chapter 3, FDR International Speculator. One of the most morale damaging aspects of the inflation was the sack of Germany that occurred at the height of the 1923 inflation. Anyone who possessed dollars or sterling was king in Germany. A few American dollars would allow a man to live like a millionaire. Foreigners swarmed into the country, buying up family treasures, estates, jewelry, and artworks at unbelievably low prices. Majori Palmer, 1918 to 1923, German hyperinflation. Franklin D. Roosevelt was organizer and president of several speculative international finance enterprises linking Germany and the United States, and in particular one enterprise to profit from the ruinous German hyperinflation of 1922 to 23. In 1922, FDR became president and was one of the organizers of United European Investors, Ltd., with a Canadian charter, but based at 160 Broadway, New York. In 1927, FDR was also organizer of the International Germanic Trust Company, INC, and the Federal International Investment Trust, which never got off the ground. But by far the most important of these speculative enterprises in the world of international finance was United European Investors Ltd. Formed to accumulate German marks deposited in the United States and to reinvest these marks in Germany by purchasing property from destitute Germans. Fully to understand the scope and meaning of United European and to allow the activities of International Germanic Trust Company, we need to make a brief review of German financial conditions in the early 1920s. The German hyperinflation of 1922 to 23. Lionel Robbins, the prominent British economist, has described the German inflation of 1922 to 23. It was the most colossal thing of its kind in history, and next probably to the Great War itself, it must bear responsibility for many of the political and economic difficulties of our generation. It destroyed the wealth of the more solid elements of German society and left behind a moral and economic disequilibrium, a breeding ground for the disasters which have followed Hitler as the foster child of the inflation. The Treaty of Versailles imposed a massive reparations burden upon a defeated Germany, a country already financially weak from fighting World War I, with deficit spending and post-war territorial reduction, with consequently reduced natural resources. Reparations have an effect on the balancing of payments similar to imports. They require either taxation or deficit spending to offset the drain. If the course of the deficit spending is followed, the result will be inflationary, and this was the course followed in Germany. Germany was obligated by the Allies to make recompense for all damage to private property except in Russia and to pay all costs of Allied troops on German soil, but no maximum limit was set on the demands. Germany had forthwith to surrender 100 billion gold marks, with payments of 1 billion gold marks annually after 1921. The final payments plan worked out to the London Ultimatum in May 1921 reflected these harsh and impossible terms and so provided a clear incentive to inflate to remove the burden of deficit direct payments. What is extraordinary about the reparations program is the identity of the so-called experts engaged in making the reparations arrangements, incidentally creating the monetary and social chaos alluded to by Lionel Robbins. The 1923 Reparations Committee had as its U.S. members Brigadier General Charles G. Dawes and Owen de Young and General Electric Company. The 1928 Committee of Experts on the Young Plan comprised on the American side Owen D. Young and J.P. Morgan, with Thomas N. Perkins and Thomas W. Lamont as alternatives. On the German side, the members were Hjalmar Schlacht and A. Vogler, with C. Melchior and L. Kostel as alternatives. In brief, the General Electric Morgan elements prominent in the Bolshevik Revolution, and as we shall see, also prominent in the New Deal, were the negotiators of a scheme generally regarded as one of the prime causes of World War II, and incidentally a scheme in which the same financiers as well as Franklin Delano Roosevelt were to profit. It is also worthy of note that the businessmen on the German side of the reparations negotiations were associated with the rise of National Socialism in Germany. Witness Hal Garten in his essay Adolf Hitler and German Heavy Industry. In November 1918, a group of the Reich's most prominent businessmen comprising Steins, Albert Vogler, then director of the Gleiskirchen Mining Company Ltd., Karl Friedrich von Siemens, Felix Deutsche of German General Electric, Director Mankiewicz of the Deutsche Bank, and Director Salmachan of the, financed the movement of a Hitler forerunner, one Dr. Edward Stadler, who demanded the establishment of a German National Socialist state. The pertinent point is that the Felix Deutsche mentioned was a director of German General Electric, and the American reparations representatives included Owen D. Young of General Electric, while the Albert Vogler mentioned by Helgarten was the German representative in the Young Plan negotiations. The depreciation of the German mark into worthless paper currency as a result of the reparations burden imposed by these men is illustrated in the following table. German marks in terms of the inflation accelerated following the formation of United European Investors Ltd. With Franklin D. Roosevelt as president and John V. Berenberg Gosselaar as a member of the German Advisory Board. The inflation went entirely out of control following the dismissal of Chancellor Wilhelm Kuno, who returned as president of HAPAG, and co-director John von Berenberg-Gossler and Max Warburg. The policies that led to the ruinous German inflation were initiated under Chancellor Wilhelm Kuno, who was immediately prior to becoming Chancellor the president of Hamburg American Line HAPAG. Two of Kuno's co-directors at HAPAG were Max Warburg, Hamburg banker and brother of Paul Warburg, members of the Federal Reserve System Advisory Board in the United States, and John V. Berenberg-Gossler, a member of the German Advisory Board of Franklin D. Roosevelt's United European Investors Ltd. Kuno was dismissed as German Chancellor in August 1923, but it will be noted from the table that inflation was already out of hand, and in November of that year, the mark had depreciated to zero. The point to be made is that Wilhelm Kuno was a Chancellor in 1922 to 23 when the mark was rapidly depreciating, and that Kuno came from a business circle that was able and willing to take pecuniary and personal advantage of the German inflation. This terrifying monetary inflation and the ultimate collapse of the German mark in 1923 ruined the German middle class and benefited three groups: a few German big businessmen, a few foreign businessmen who were in a position to gain advantage from the inflation, and the rising Hitler movement. As president of United European Investors Ltd., Franklin D. Roosevelt was among these foreign businessmen who took advantage of Germany's misery for their own gain. The background of William Shaw. Unfortunately, there is a deeper perspective to this question of what could be called an elite group preying on the world's misfortune. In the previous volume in the series, Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution, we identified personal links between Wall Street financiers and Bolshevik revolutionaries. Some of these personal links can be extended to FDR and United European Investors. The precisely established links previously implicated the then German ambassador to the United States, Count von Bernstorff, and his friend Adolf von Pavensted, senior partner in the Amsnick & Co., who was for many years a chief paymaster of the German spy system in this country. Amsnick & Co. was controlled by the J.P. Morgan and John D. Rockefeller and other New York financial interests through American International Corporation. With Guarantee Trust Company, the American International Corporation constituted the central points for financing German and Bolshevik espionage in the United States and North America during World War I. Adolf von Pavensted and Edmund Pavensted, the two Amsnick partners, were also members of another financial house, Mueller, Shaw & Company. And it is at Mueller Shaw that in 1922 we find Franklin D. Roosevelt and his United European Investors Ltd. After the public disclosures in 1918 of the connection between Amsnick & Co. and German espionage, the German investors in Mueller, Shaw & Co. were represented by Edmund S. Payne, a New York attorney. Mueller, Shaw & Co. was formally liquidated, and a new firm, William Shaw & Co., took its place at the same address, 45 William Street, New York City. The new firm, formed in January 1918, included the two original partners, William Shaw and Carl Mueller, who were now joined by John Hanway of Harris, Forbes & Co., Frank M. Welty, Vice President of American Colonial Bank of Puerto Rico, and attorney Edmund S. Payne, a partner in the law firm of Rounds, Hatch, Dillingham, and Debevoise, who represented the German interests of the former Mueller, Shaw & Co. The Pavensteds were also heavily interested in Puerto Rican sugar properties and own and control the Central Las Canoas. William Shaw was president of the Colonial Bank of Puerto Rico and president of the South Puerto Rico Sugar Company. Similarly, the Roosevelt family had interests in the Caribbean sugar industry going back to the late 18th century, and George Emlyn Roosevelt was in 1918 a director of Cuban Cane Products Co. in New York. It is therefore conceivable that through this common interest in Caribbean sugar, the Pavensteds and Roosevelts became known to each other. In any event, it was the Shaw-Pavenstock Group, previously part of the German espionage operation in the United States, that in 1921-22 merged with Franklin Delano Roosevelt and several dubious financial entrepreneurs to form United European Investors Ltd. To profit from the crushing burden of German inflation. The original organizing group for European Investors Ltd. Comprised the aforementioned William Shaw and Franklin D. Roosevelt, joined by A.R. Roberts, Charles L. Gould, and Harvey Fisk & Sons. The 60,000 preferred shares issued were held by Harvey Fisk & Sons, $25,000, Franklin D. Roosevelt, $10,000, and Shaw, Roberts, and Gould, $5,000 each. In brief, FDR was the largest individual preferred shareholder of the incorporating group. United European Investors Ltd. was granted an unusual Canadian charter that provided the company with unique powers, including the right to promote trade and commerce between Canada and any other country, to acquire title to property, underwrite or otherwise deal in bonds, stocks, and shares, act as brokers, agents, undertake all kinds of functions in regard to purchase, exchange, and transfer of stocks and shares, lend money, carry on any business, manufacturing or otherwise, and buy and sell property. In fact, on reading the charter, it is difficult to visualize any activity that could not be carried out under its numerous clauses. The capital stock was divided into two segments: Canadian, $60,000 divided into 60,000 preference shares, and 60,000 ordinary shares denominated in 10,000 German marks. The objective of the company, as noted in the contemporary press, was to invest the many billions of German marks then held in the United States and Canada in German real property. Once marks are invested in property in Germany, the fund should begin to earn money immediately, and the funds cannot disappear since they are represented by the ownership of tangible property, and the advantage may still be taken of a possible rise in exchange value. Compared with this, the holding of mark currency or drafts is a most hazardous operation, and the funds are either idle or earning very little. Besides, if the exchange quotation should approach the vanishing point, there may be nothing tangible left for the holders of marks or drafts. The capital of the company will be invested in improved real estate, mortgages, financing of goods in transit, and participation in profitable industrial and commercial enterprises. Reference to the preceding table recording depreciation of the German mark, page 39, confirms the remarkable timeliness of United European Investors Ltd. In July 1922, the mark, with 1913 as a base of 100, was at 117 in foreign exchange. This reflects a heavy rate of inflation of the mark, but nothing to distinguish it from inflation in many other countries. Yet the UEI brochure specifically mentions the possibility of the marks approaching the vanishing point, which it did achieve a year later in November 1923. The actual investment of UEI was carried out in Germany by a German advisory board that occupied an office in Hamburg, headed by Senator August Lottmann, formerly a partner in G. Amsnick and Company of New York. See page 41. The second member of this German board was Senator John V. Barenberg-Gossler, head of the Hamburg banking firm Barenberg-Gossler & Co. Barenberg-Gossler was also a member of the management board of the Hamburg American Line, HAPAG. And other members were William Kuno, at that time Chancellor of Germany and responsible for his country's economic policy, and Max Warburg, brother of Paul Warburg, member of the Federal Reserve Board in the United States. In a letter dated November the 11th, 1922 to UEI, the German Advisory Board recorded its initial investments. All the investments so far made are of first-class industrial shares. However, their prospectus issued in the U.S. emphasized investment in real estate. And on this point, the German board wrote, "As to investing in mortgages, we understand your point of view, but shall eventually come back to the question in case we shall be able to offer you mortgages with a gold clause, which might be possible, and would exclude any additional risk in case the market should further decline." There is no mention anywhere in the United European Investors file of the purchase of real property or any of the tangible mentioned in the company charter and the public announcements. The investments made by the board during the next few years were stocks of German companies. Further, the investment prices were cited in an unusual manner, not in German marks or absolute figures of any kind, but as a percentage increase, presumably from a 1913 base, which enabled the German board to write to New York, "The shares which you so far bought have risen considerably with the depreciation of the mark." These shares and the percentages increase cited included, for example. So here's a few here. The German board did not mention the fact that the depreciation of the mark in terms of the US dollar had been greater than the advance in the prices of the shares they bought as quoted in German marks. In effect, the claims of rising share prices made were illusory. One earlier writer has described it this way: untrue and pure bunco steering, evidently intended to gull other holders of German marks to invest them with a company that could perform such miracles. There was not, however, of concern to the New York Board of Directors at the regular meeting of the board held January the 15th, 1923. Franklin D. Roosevelt called the meeting to order, and George W. Mueller acted as secretary. It was then recorded that the mark value of the German stock investments so far made by the company was more or less 73 million marks, and his investment was currently quoted at 420 million marks. There is an interesting letter in FDR files from Professor Homer B. Vanderbilt, professor of business economics at Harvard University, asking for explanations about the UEI investment program. The letter was addressed to FDR as president of the company, but replied to by Edmund S. Payne, who stated that the original idea of investing in tangible property such as real estate had proven impracticable, as it would entail a very heavy overhead owing to the necessity of supervision and operation. So it was decided to invest only in German stocks representing the indirect ownership in tangible assets. Payne added that the theory justified itself to a remarkable degree. Taking as a test the first marks, 60 million, invested by the company, we find that the appreciation in price of the securities has somewhat exceeded the depreciation in exchange value of the mark. In other words, the securities purchased could probably be sold today for a price in marks, which would bring somewhat more in dollars than could have been secured by the holders of marks, had they sold them at the time of the investment, in spite of the fact that the value of their marks has gone down tremendously. However, Payne to the contrary, a statement of conditions as of January the 31st, 1923, located in FDR's files records that the book value per share of common stock at the time was $2.62 per share, while the average book value at the time of the investment was $2.64 per share. In other words, a slight decline. At the directors' meeting of September 19, 1923, it was confirmed that the total dollar value of the investment was about $120,000. And in May 1925, this was still approximately the amount recorded in the Treasury. However, in the intervening years following the stabilization of the mark, conditions improved, and a statement dated May the 12th, 1926, shows a net worth of $140,098.07 with 17,275 shares outstanding, and then equal to $8.50 per share. On May the 21st, 1926, the company offered to buy all stock offered within 90 days at $7.50 a share. In May 1926, FDR resigned as president and accepted the offer of $7.50 per unit for his 1,005 common stock shares. Did the American holders of German marks who invested in United European investors gain or lose on their investment? If we suppose they held their stocks in 1926 and accepted the company offer at $7.50 per common share unit, then buying at the issue price of 10,000 German marks in September of 1922, the date offered, they would have lost considerably. In September 1922, the dollar mark exchange rate was $1 to 764 German marks. Thus, a 10,000 mark share would be equivalent to $13 per share, and a share held from 1922 to 1926 would have realized a loss of approximately $5.50 per share. On the other hand, a shareholder would have avoided total depreciation and a loss of all his funds from holding on. Investigation of United European Investors Ltd. The Roberts Gould element that joined FDR and Schall on the board of the UEI had a poor reputation on the street. In fact, Roberts and Gould were under investigation for suspected criminal activities. In July 1922, when United European was in the early stages of incorporation, a Mr. Crary, an old-time investigator for Proudfoot's Mercantile Agency, the top-ranking investigation agency used by prestigious Wall Street firms, approached FDR Secretary Miss Lee Hand. Crary conveyed to Missy information about what he termed a band of crooks with offices at 7 Pine Street, and with a nameplate on the door inscribed United European Investors Ltd. Missy LeHand carried the information to FDR's right-hand man, Lewis Howe, who in turn raised the problem with Schall's earlier partner, Mueller. From Mueller and other sources, Howe learned that Roberts and Gould were a part of this alleged band of crooks who, according to Crary, were engaged in all manner of disreputable promoting, and he is certain that they have, as a member of their force, an ex-convict under an assumed name with a most unsavory reputation. When the name United European Investors Ltd. Was posted on the office door at 7 Pine Street, investigator Crary, who had been routinely watching the office for a year, began quietly probing Roberts and Gould. Although Roberts was never in the 7 Pine Street office, Crary found that Gould had been in the habit of using the office for at least a year and was considered one of their, i.e., the crooks, tried and true friends. Gould's association with the crooks made Crary suspicious because the Proudfoot agency had previously given Gould a clean enough record. And it also put him in the professional promoter class. Crary's investigation was undertaken on behalf of the owners of the building at 7 Pine Street, who intended to dispossess the whole bunch in a short time. It was during the investigation that Proudfoot Agency came upon a circular listing the name of Franklin D. Roosevelt as the president of United European Investors Ltd., and William Shaw as its banker. The evidence unearthed by the Proudfoot Agency was substantiated to Lewis Howe by a Mr. Hanway, a member of the stock brokerage firm of Harris Forbes. Hanway said he had been familiar with Mr. Gould's activities for a number of years, and that he so thoroughly distrusted him as to lead him to make every effort to prevent him from meeting Shaw originally. Even further, the Proudfoot Agency suspected that Gould had attempted to acquire confidential information from them, and that Gould was acting as a spy for the crooks to find out what knowledge Proudfoot and Company had of their crooked deals. All of this information was duly reported by Howe in a letter, Dear Boss, to FDR, July 29th, 1922. Probably most businessmen faced with this caliber of partner would abandon any proposed operation, such as European United Investors. But Howe's memorandum to FDR recommends nothing of the kind. It reads in part, my recommendations are as follows, that Gould and Roberts be directed to immediately find new offices, preferably in a church or some other respectable place, that we get rid of Roberts, who is a wild man on publicity anyway, and he has no important function in this game, and that the closest watch be kept of Gould. If Mr. Crary actually turns up the circular, I would tear off the roof over it and make sure that its use is stopped until we are ready to make a formal announcement. I think it would be wise to insist that during the summer I be made a member of the board of directors, particularly as both Jenks and Rogers will be away most of the time, and someone wants to watch every action taken. In other words, Howe suggests that precautions against double dealing will be sufficient, and that the best way to do this is to put Lewis Howe on the board of directors. In any event, the enterprise went forward as planned. Roberts became secretary of the UEI, and Gould, alleged spy for the crooks, retained his role as active promoter and continued to report periodically to FDR by letter on the progress of their fundraising efforts. On July the 20th, before Howe reported to FDR the substance of the Proudfoot investigation, Gould had written FDR from the Southern Hotel, Baltimore, about his talks with Edward Clark & Co., the Baltimore bankers whose partner Herbert Clark had known FDR from their Harvard days. Then on August the 13th, 1923, Gould wrote FDR from the Canadian Club of New York, to relay telegrams received from William Shaw in Europe, and concluded, I was sorry to hear you were again under the weather, probably too much overdoing. One must not try to go fast after such an illness. In any case, I hope to have the pleasure of seeing you before I return to Europe in early September. There was no clue that the FDR communicated in any way with Gould, and the next letter in the file is from Gould to FDR, dated September the 14th, 1923, and also written from the Canadian Club of New York. This letter criticized the jealous bankers whose scheme we hurt and whose plans we upset. Had we not issued today, we would have failed. Gould then concludes, thank you for your great and noble way you have stood behind us, and I personally feel it was your strong attitude which is making our project a complete success, adding that when he, Gould, called on the large banks and trust companies to present their proposal, he found on every hand your name, FDR, was applauded as being the mastermind in securing the proper aid to the unfortunate American investor. And that if FDR could have heard these comments from the largest financial houses, it would have given him great satisfaction. On the basis of these letters, we must conclude that FDR knowingly entered a business arrangement with the persons whose reputation was, to say the least, dubious, and that this business arrangement was continued after evidence of impropriety was brought to FDR's attention by Missy LeHand and Lewis Howe. There is only one superficial evidence that the whole United European Investors operation was designed by Roosevelt, when Gould tells FDR that his name was applauded as being the mastermind. It is reasonable to assume that Gould was flattering Roosevelt for his own purposes. There is really no evidence either way in the files or elsewhere that FDR's background and financial knowledge were sufficient to originate a plan as ingenious as UEI. Okay, well, everybody, that's all for tonight. This is part 2 of Wall Street and FDR. So we have Minoan in the chat. You're always there, Minoan. Glad to have you. It's Todd Lewis of the Praise of Fly podcast, signing off.